Hey guys, this is Mr. Allison, and this is your test review for Unit 5. All right, so I'm just going to go through the questions on the test, kind of summarize the main ideas you need to know and study for. Be sure you look back over all of the notes, including the last presentation over Russia, which we didn't cover in class, so make sure you look back over that information. All right, so first off, as always, you always need to know how to read a map. And interpret a map. So that's not any different. And then architecture, you need to be able to recognize some of your big landmarks and styles of architecture. So for example, like the Colosseum in Rome, you should know what that looks like when you see a picture of it. Same thing for the Parthenon in Greece and Athens. And then also Roman aqueducts. Those are the where they carried water on. And so you should be able to recognize that. And of course know that the Roman Empire, which built a lot of these buildings, or at least were influenced by some of the architecture of these buildings, like the Parthenon, were all along the Mediterranean. So when you see this type of architecture in these buildings, it's going to be related to the Mediterranean area. And then of course remember what GDP is. There'll be some charts and stuff looking at GDP. And then Scandinavia, we talked about glaciation. As glaciers cut through the landscape in Scandinavia, they created fjords. And so the fjords are those steep kind of V-shaped valleys that were created due to glaciation. So glaciation is just a glacier eroding away the land. And as these glaciers melted, they created these lakes also high up in the mountains. And then the northern European plain, we talked about that as being the main area where people grew crops and still do today. And so some of your first settlers in Europe settled along the northern European plain. It runs through northern France, Germany, Poland, all the way into Russia. And so in Russia, that's where a lot of their farming is today as well. All right, and then looking at pollution. Pollution is a major problem in Europe, and because of that, and because of the fact that you have so many countries in a small area, it takes a lot of regional cooperation to work together and make sure that pollution is taken care of. So, it doesn't make any difference if Germany takes care of their pollution issues if France isn't also working on it, and Poland and Austria and Switzerland, all these countries that are around them, because otherwise you're not really fixing much of anything. And then the physical geography of Russia. So if you look at their rivers and their drainage systems, they pretty much all drain into the Arctic Ocean. So they go north into the Arctic Ocean. That's just a basic map question. And then you'll see a term on the test, the term failed country. And so a failed country is a country where you see a failed economy, where the economy fell apart, like the Soviet Union. And then, of course, all of the Eastern Bloc states that were once part of the Soviet Union. So a failed country is going to have a very low standard of living. You're going to see a lot more poverty, unstable government, unstable economy, of course, lack of jobs, things of that sort. So things aren't going to be going well at all. And then the Europe deals with a very dense population throughout the region. And this, I'm so sorry, I'm looking at the question too as I answer this. Their dense population, a lot of it comes because of industrialization. And so they moved into the major cities looking for jobs and stuff like that. And so you see very dense populations in these cities moving around those areas as they industrialized. Then need to remember a term, we talked about this back in Unit 2, continentality. And so we see continentality big time in Siberia, out in the middle of Russia. And remember, that's where you're away from the moderating effects of the ocean. So the further away you are from the ocean, the more drastic your climate's going to be as far as temperatures in the winter and summer and how different they are from each other. And then looking at the euro, the money itself, the euro is an example of how Europe has worked together in recent years. And so with the creation of the European Union and then the euro, we're seeing a lot more regional cooperation among these countries. And so it's basically leading to a more positive future, in a future in Europe where we'll see a lot less warfare. Hopefully, that's the goal, a lot less warfare throughout the continent because of this regional cooperation and them getting along. And then communism, just obviously communism is going to be big in this test, dealing with the Soviet Union. And so first off, you need to remember what communism is. So the idea of communism is that everything is controlled by the government, all the means of production. And anytime you see that term, means of production, we're talking about the economy. And so everything's controlled by the government, all business and everything. And that's a big reason why it failed, because the government couldn't successfully control the entire economy for the entire area effectively by any means. And so that's going to be a big reason for their fail. And then a key difference between the free market system or free enterprise system, remember that's the kind of system we have, the capitalist system, and the communist system. Of course, the big thing is that in a command economy, which is communist, you're going to see government controlling everything and deciding what's produced. Whereas in a free enterprise economy, it is determined by the consumer. So the consumer demand in our economy decides what is produced and available to us within our economy. Whereas in Russia during the Soviet Union, they just built whatever they wanted. All right, there'll be some quotes as well. Just make sure you pay attention to who is speaking. And, obviously what they're talking about, but who is speaking, because that's going to give you a big idea of what the answer is going to be. So remember, another key term just to remember is the word Soviet. Anytime you see the word Soviet, we're talking about the Soviet Union, which means communist Russia. So anytime we're talking about that, that's what we're talking about. Remember, the Soviet Union fell in 1991. It's no longer around. It's no longer communist. So anytime we say the word Soviet, we're talking about something from the Soviet time period when Russia was communist. And also, again, remember, too, that command economy is the same thing as communist. It's just two different words. Then the Cold War. Obviously, you should know what the Cold War is by now. We talked about it with U.S. and Canada. And then again here. So the Cold War was that conflict between the U.S. and USSR. And we used, the buildup of nuclear weapons, alliances, things like that. We never actually went head-on with each other. So there wasn't mass death or anything like that. There was a threat of mass death, but it never happened. So there's no military fighting, just a lot of spying and a lot of other things we did to compete against each other. And then going back to the EU again, looking at what the EU has done to kind of help economic development, cooperation in Europe. So besides creating the euro, another thing they did is reduce trade barriers. And so kind of like with NAFTA in the United States, Canada, Mexico, get rid of these trade barriers so it's easier for goods to be traded among the European countries and shared. I mean, back before the EU really came around, like one thing when I was in France that we talked about when I was there is that the French would actually set on fire 18-wheelers coming out of Italy, going into Spain or leaving Spain, trying to go to Italy or Germany, because they wanted to be the ones that controlled trade and made the most money, and they didn't want Italy or Spain to be able to benefit. And so now they don't set fires anymore to 18-wheelers, and so that's a huge benefit from that cooperation. All right, and then, of course, know what human-environment interaction is. There'll be some questions on here looking at that. So obviously, again, that's any time that humans change the environment around them in order to adapt to it to live there. So you could look at Venice as an example and building those artificial islands to live on the ocean. The polders that are created in the Netherlands by pushing back the ocean and reclaiming land from the ocean. And then like the channel that was built to connect England to France. All right, then you know about the North Atlantic Drift, also known as the Gulf Stream. So that's the warm water that comes from the United States over towards Europe, and that's what really warms up Europe and keeps them with a moderate climate. So even though they're so far north, they have a much more moderate climate than what you would see in Canada at the same latitude. All right, and then looking at the different ethnic and cultural groups in Europe, like why do we have so many different groups and languages in such a small area? And really the big reason is the mountains. Now, of course, you have the Alps, which is the biggest chain there as far as height and everything. But all throughout Europe, there's mountains. And these mountains separated all these different groups to where you get the formation of different languages and cultures. And so in some areas throughout Europe, especially during the Middle Ages, you could go from one valley to the next, literally maybe just 30, 40 miles away from each other, and see a different language, at least a different dialect, different culture. And so the mountains do a lot to separate people because it's so hard to get around them. All right, and then looking at the world trade that Europe does, one of the biggest reason why they're able to benefit a lot from world trade and trade so much on the ocean is simply their access to the ocean. It is a continent of peninsulas. And so if you look at Europe as a whole, it's a giant peninsula, but then you have smaller peninsulas within that. And so that much access to the ocean, of course, allows them so much trade. And so many of the countries in Europe can trade with others around the world due to their access to the ocean. All right, then after World War II, generally know how Europe was divided. So the whole eastern half of Europe fell to the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union controlled that whole part. Another term for that you'll see is the Eastern Bloc, BLOC. And that's talking about those countries in Eastern Europe that were part of the Soviet Union. And then Scandinavian countries, that's Norway, Sweden, and Finland, so far northern Europe. The characteristic they have in common with each other is social welfare systems. So you see a lot of socialism in that area. So remember, socialism is not the same as communism. Socialism is merely just social systems to help people out, like retirement. The education system we have here is a socialist system. And so anything that benefits the public and is usually paid for through taxpayer money is a socialist system. All right, going back to Unit 2, a term you need to remember is your replacement rate or fertility rate. And so a lot of European countries are suffering from a shrinking population due to them just not having enough kids. And so the question is, okay, what is the replacement rate? Like, how many kids do you need to have in order to keep the population stable? And the answer to that's 2, because remember, you're talking about a mom and daddy, they have 2 kids, the mom and dad are going to die before the kids most likely. And so, therefore, the children replace the parents in the population, and your population over time stays stable. And so, most European countries are seeing a fertility rate below 2, and that's why we're seeing a shrinking population in many European countries. Italy and Germany, definitely. All right, and so tying in with that, so population changes that we've seen in Europe since the year 2000 has really all been slow and negative growth. And so that's the theme throughout Europe is either very slow growth or it's just flat out negative. They are shrinking. And so really all of the growth in Europe right now is through immigration. Of course, Syria right now providing a lot of those immigrants. And then the reason why in Europe you see a lot of the policies, like I mentioned in Sweden, to where, if a woman is working and she has a baby, that she can stay home for 2 years and get full pay and keep her position. The reason why they're doing things like that in Europe is to encourage people to have kids. And so they're basically rewarding them like, hey, if you have a family, then we'll reward you. And so a lot of the businesses there are very family friendly and allow a lot of vacation time and really encourage you to have a lot of time with your family. So that way you don't have to make a choice between career or family. You can have both and have it equally. All right, and then again, just kind of some basic history. So, with the fall of communism during that time, as the Soviet Union fell, a couple of things that happened kind of around that time period. First off, 15 republics split out from the Soviet Union, and so they became independent countries. You saw Yugoslavia disappear, and you saw conflict build up in the early 90s in that region in the Balkan Peninsula. And then Germany reunified in 1991 after the fall of the Berlin Wall and, of course, the fall of the Soviet Union. And so that's what you see. That's what basically the events that signaled the end of the Soviet Union. So 15 republics separating, Yugoslavia separating, and you see in conflict break out with Slobodan Milosevic leading the Yugoslav National Army. That war we talked about on Tuesday. And then the reunification of Germany. All right, and then factors you need for a country to work well. We've kind of talked about this as far as what needs to be happening for a country to do well. And so first off, you need a free enterprise system. You need an economy that allows people to produce whatever it is that they want to produce and go into business for themselves. In order to do that, you need a lot of natural resources. So you need access to these natural resources so you can create things and have what you need in order to make. And then, of course, democracy. Democracy is what fuels creation and creativity and just that desire to do things on your own. Because, like in our culture, we have this. We're able to think freely and think creatively, and if you have an idea, you can pursue it and do it and see if you can make money off of it. In many countries, that's just not possible, and in places where you see communism, or there was a history of communism like in Russia today, that actually stifles the creativity of the population. Those people do not think the same way we do because their culture is different, and culture is what shapes the way you think. And so you're not going to see as much creativity and as much you could say entrepreneurship, people pursuing things to make money on their own, because that's just not part of their culture. It hasn't been there. And so those things are what are needed in order for economy to really do well and our nation to do great. All right, then some more readings as well. Just a couple of terms you need to know. So the term homogeneous, that means a population is the same. They're all of the same background and culture. And then a heterogeneous population is a population that is mixed, and so you have a lot of different cultures coming in and stuff like that. And just make sure you remember the difference between homogeneous and heterogeneous. All right, and then basic comparison of NAFTA and the EU. So, of course, remember the main thing with NAFTA and the EU is economic prosperity. So we're looking for economic cooperation among the member states in order to help all of them advance and do better. So here with NAFTA, of course, we're helping Mexico do better and improve their economy. And in Europe, it's helping your poorer countries in Eastern Europe and also Southern Europe, like Italy and Greece, to improve their economies with the help of your strong economies like Germany, the UK, and Norway and Sweden and Finland. And then going back to the conflict in the Balkan Peninsula with the breakup of Yugoslavia, we saw a lot of nationalism there. So nationalism or nationalist trends can see how fighting is usually divided among ethnic lines, and so people unite together in order to fight any other country or nation that fights them. And then, of course, going back to Bosnia during the 1990s, people fled that region because of the fighting, because of the ethnic cleansing. There was a genocide going on, and so a lot of people from there, especially the Albanians, started fleeing to different parts of Europe. All right, and then you should be able to look at a map and be able to tell what countries were part of the Eastern Bloc, so which ones were part of the Soviet Union. So you need to know kind of your regions of Europe. Where's Western Europe? Where's Scandinavia? Where's the Balkan Peninsula? Where are the Eastern Bloc states? Things like that. So make sure you know where those are located on the map. Then a couple of charts you can look at. I'm not going to go over that. Just know the term Human Development Index. You'll see this on a lot of the tests. Human Development Index is referring to basically overall how people are doing in that country. So countries that have a high HDI ranking are going to be countries that have a high per capita income, unemployment rate's low. So basically standard of living is pretty high. The countries where you see, a low per capita income, higher unemployment, things like that, they're going to have a lower ranking on the HDI. So HDI is almost like a way of ranking happiness in a way. Then a couple more quotes to look at. So again, you should be fine on those. Population pyramid. Just remember with Russia that their population is shrinking, and so they're having a lot less kids. And this could affect their economy later on. Of course, here pretty soon they're going to be dealing with an aging population, so taking care of them. And then in the future, it's just going to be having enough workers to really sustain a growing economy. And then as far as comparing Latin American countries and Eastern European countries, they're both struggling. And they're struggling because they had years of dictatorship over them, and so they're struggling to come out of that and really do well as a democracy and grow their economies. So Latin America and Eastern Europe have a lot in common in that sense. And then going back to Unit 1, just remember your plate tectonics, what kind of your different boundaries and things like that when it comes to earthquakes. And then kind of a little history question, going back to plague. The plague in the 1300s, remember that was spread from China merchants from China coming across the Silk Roads brought with them rats as well, and they end up getting on the ships, and then these ships go into Italian harbors, and the rats get off, and then they die, and then the ticks and stuff get off, and then bite the humans, and then there you get the plague from there, and it began to spread throughout Europe and killed about half the population. And then physical geography, again, just know the dividing line between Europe and Asia, which we consider to be the Ural Mountains. So when you get on the east side of the Ural Mountains is where Asia begins. You see more of an Asian cultural influence on that side of the mountains. And then know how to read a climate graph. There was one on the last test, so just pay attention. When you look at graphs, just make sure you pay attention to the key and everything, and you know how to read it. And you need to know your basic climate regions. And so, Mediterranean climate's going to be warm most of the year, so you'll have winters in the 40s and 50s, summers 80s, 90s. Your highland climates are going to be like Switzerland and stuff up in the Alps, so cold a lot of the year. Russia's humid continental, that is, so you obviously more humid climate, but since it's continental, you're going to see very cold temperatures in the winter. And then subarctic and far north, and that should be self-explanatory what that would be like. And then let's see what else. A couple more quotes, a couple more charts. And then that's it. So that's basically what you need to know for the test. So make sure you watch this video as many times as possible. Take some notes, look back over the notes, read over them several times, and you should be fine. Good luck.